Imagine arriving at your serene lake cabin for a peaceful getaway, only to find 230 uninvited strangers turning it into a chaotic party led by the ultimate HOA tyrant. What happened next? A masterful revenge that toppled her empire forever. I was still rubbing the sleep from my eyes when my boots hit the gravel driveway of my lake cabin, expecting a morning of quiet fishing and coffee by the water. When I froze like I'd stepped into a nightmare or the set of a bad reality show. 230 strangers were stomping all over my dock, grills smoking, beer cans floating in the lake. Someone had parked a jet ski on my lawn. And right there in the middle of it all stood Karen, the HOA president, holding a megaphone and yelling welcome announcements as if my private property had suddenly turned into a public carnival ground. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing until a kid ran past me holding my fishing rod, followed by a man wearing my bathrobe like he owned it, shouting that he'd booked this place online. I blinked, but it wasn't a dream. Karen spotted me, waved, and yelled, "Oh, good. You made it to your own cabin. You can help us set up the dessert tables." And the crowd laughed like this was some kind of joke. That was the exact second I realized I wasn't just dealing with rude neighbors anymore. I was staring down the craziest power trip in HOA history. And by the end of the week, someone was going to regret this invasion of my land in ways they never imagined. I dropped my duffel bag and stormed down the path, heart pounding with a mix of fury and disbelief. The sight was worse up close. My dock, the one I built with my own hands, had people dancing on it like it was a nightclub. A barbecue pit sat right over the spot where my boat trailer usually rested, dripping grease all over my fresh-cut grass. My Adirondack chairs were missing, replaced by cheap plastic folding chairs someone had rented. Every inch of the place screamed chaos, music blasting so loud it echoed across the lake and beer bottles clinking like it was Mardi Gras. Karen, with her perfect bob haircut and neon pink blazer, stood proudly on my porch steps like a queen surveying her kingdom. I barely got a word out before she slapped a laminated badge on my chest that read property volunteer like I'd agreed to the circus. She grinned in that smug way only an HOA tyrant could manage and announced to the crowd that our generous community member has offered his cabin for this summer kickoff event. As if my silence counted as consent. I yanked off the badge and snapped that this was private property and everyone needed to leave immediately. Karen, without missing a beat, looked down her nose at me and said, "According to HOA policy, communal resources must be shared during special events, and your cabin qualifies as a lakeside resource." My jaw dropped. She went on about community unity and how lucky I was to contribute. Behind her, people were opening my fridge, my food disappearing, someone's dog ran through my living room, tracking mud on the rug, and kids screamed as they cannonballed off my dock, splashing water onto my expensive fishing gear. When I threatened to call the sheriff, Karen crossed her arms and said with a sly grin, "Oh, honey, they're already coming to join us." It only got worse when I discovered she'd sent an online invitation weeks ago advertising my cabin as the venue for a mega HOA lake bash, charging $50 a head to cover event costs and had pocketed over $10,000. The guests had no idea I hadn't approved it. They thought I was hosting this madhouse willingly. One guy even patted me on the back saying, "Thanks for the invite, man. Best party spot ever." My blood boiled, my hands clenched into fists, but I knew losing my temper now would only make things worse. Karen was loving the scene too much, loving the power trip, basking in the attention like a reality TV villain. When I demanded proof of this ridiculous HOA rule she kept citing, she waved a clipboard in my face with something scribbled on it that looked more like a grocery list than an actual bylaw. As the sun climbed higher, more cars arrived, parking halfway up my driveway, across my lawn, blocking my boat ramp. A rented food truck pulled up, spewing diesel smoke, frying onion rings for the masses. The air stank of beer and burnt meat. My peaceful retreat had turned into a county fair I never agreed to host. The sound system blared badass 80s rock so loud my windows rattled. Neighbors I barely knew strolled past me, holding paper plates piled with ribs, acting like they'd been entitled to this space all along. Every time I opened my mouth to protest, Karen interrupted with that condescending tone. "If you're not here to help, kindly step aside. We have a schedule to keep." She even announced a fireworks show planned for midnight right over my lake without a word to me beforehand. But what made my blood turn to fire was the way she told me in front of everyone that this cabin didn't really belong to me the way I thought it did. She claimed the HOA had the right to repurpose underused properties for community benefit, implying that because I wasn't here every weekend, they could just take it over whenever they wanted. That smug declaration drew applause from a few sycophantic neighbors, making it clear she thought she had full control of my land. My face burned with anger, but under that fury, a cold thought started forming. Karen had crossed the line this time, too far to step back. She thought she was untouchable. Thought I'd cave like every other poor soul who'd fallen victim to her ridiculous HOA antics. But what she didn't know was that I'd been pushed one time too many. I quietly started filming everything on my phone. The strangers trampling my flowers, the money changing hands, Karen barking orders like a dictator. I took mental notes of every violation, every trespass, every dollar she scammed out of this so-called community event. I knew right then that I wouldn't just shut this party down. I'd end her reign over my property once and for all. My pulse slowed as a dangerous calm settled over me. This was no longer about getting a few noisy guests to leave. This was about setting a boundary so strong Karen would never dare test me again. But it wouldn't happen in a screaming match on my lawn. No, it would happen in a way that made sure every single person here remembered who owned this cabin. And when it happened, Karen would be the one screaming. The next morning, the sun barely crept over the horizon when I sat in my truck across from the HOA clubhouse. The sour taste of yesterday's fiasco still clinging to my mouth like burnt coffee. My lake cabin, my sanctuary, had been turned into a war zone of beer cans, trashed lawn chairs, and barbecue stains that would never come out of the deckwood. And Karen had walked away from it all like a queen after a royal parade, smug and untouchable. I barely slept, rage buzzing in my veins like a swarm of angry bees. Yet, even in the sleepless haze, my brain refused to stop churning over what had happened. How many times had this woman twisted the HOA rules just to make life miserable for me or the neighbors? How many absurd fines had she slapped on people for having their trash bins out for 3 minutes too long or for planting flowers that didn't meet her color standards? The cabin invasion wasn't some isolated act of arrogance. It was the final boss battle after months of petty tyranny. I had to know just how deep her power trip ran. So I decided to spy on her kingdom before confronting her again, because only an idiot charges into battle without knowing where the enemy's hiding the landmines. From my truck, I watched Karen arrive, strutting out of her SUV like she owned not just the HOA, but the entire planet. A flock of board members swarmed her, hanging on her every word. Through the tinted glass, I saw her wagging a finger, lecturing them about community unity while waving the thick HOA rule book like it was a holy text. A flash of memory burned in my mind from a few months back. My neighbor Frank had been fined $200 for painting his shed door a slightly different shade of blue than what Karen approved. Another neighbor, Marissa, had been forced to remove her bird feeders because they apparently violated the HOA's wildlife management guidelines. It was always Karen's way or fines stacked on your doorstep like unwanted pizza flyers. This lake cabin stunt wasn't just about throwing a party. It was about dominance, a public show to remind everyone she could bend private property to her will, and nobody could stop her. By noon, I drove over to Frank's place under the pretense of borrowing some tools. But the second I mentioned the party disaster, he unleashed a storm of HOA horror stories I'd only heard whispers of before. Karen had tried to make him cut down a tree in his own backyard because it blocked her view from the road. When he refused, she threatened to sue, claiming the tree was a safety hazard. Marissa joined us, explaining how Karen had once demanded she replace her entire fence because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing to the community, even though it had been there for 10 years before Karen ever moved in. Story after story painted the picture of a woman who wielded the HOA like a weapon, bullying anyone who dared to stand up to her, twisting vague bylaws into personal vendettas. The more I listened, the more the fire in my gut turned into solid steel. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This was about taking down a dictator in heels. That afternoon, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting supposedly to address the unfortunate misunderstanding at my cabin. I went not to listen, but to witness how deep this insanity really ran. The meeting hall was packed. Homeowners sitting stiffly in metal folding chairs, whispering anxiously. Karen took the stage with a fake warm smile plastered on her face, clutching a clipboard as if it were a scepter. She started spinning the story immediately, telling everyone that the lake event had been a resounding success except for my unnecessary hostility, claiming I had agreed months ago to community usage of the cabin. She even waved a piece of paper supposedly bearing my signature of approval, which looked suspiciously like my name written in the handwriting of a drunk toddler. I stood up, demanding to see the original document, but Karen talked over me, accusing me of being selfish and anti-community, framing me as the villain trying to deny neighbors their joy. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, caught between fear of HOA punishment and the truth they already suspected. When the meeting adjourned, I caught snippets of conversation. As people left, many were fed up, but too scared to challenge Karen. They whispered about outrageous fines, threats of foreclosure, and retaliatory citations that appeared the moment someone questioned her authority. It was like living under a miniature dictatorship where your mailbox could deliver ruin with one stamped HOA letter. I realized Karen thrived because she ruled by fear and confusion, writing her own rules and daring anyone to stop her. My anger crystallized into something sharper than rage: strategy. Karen thought she had won because she had humiliated me in public, turned my cabin into her personal carnival ground and gotten away with it. She had no idea I had just been handed all the ammunition I needed to destroy her little empire. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, digging into every HOA document, every bylaw, every clause buried in the fine print. It was a mess of legal jargon and vague threats. But the more I read, the more I noticed Karen's pattern of interpretation, where she stretched the rules like elastic bands until they suited her whims. I made copies of everything, highlighting contradictions, noting every time she had overstepped her authority. I gathered testimonies from neighbors who had had their lives made miserable by her crusades. And then I mapped out a plan not just to reclaim my cabin, but to dismantle Karen's reign of terror piece by piece. She had played dirty, trespassing on my land, profiting from it, and mocking me in front of the community. If she wanted war, then war is exactly what she'd get, and I wouldn't just fight back. I'd make sure the whole neighborhood saw her for what she really was. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a new HOA email blast from Karen declaring my cabin an official community recreational asset permanently available for events. My hands trembled with a mix of laughter and disbelief at her audacity. She wasn't just doubling down. She was planting a flag in my yard and daring me to rip it out. Fine, I thought if she wanted to fight for ownership of my own land, she'd get one. But it wouldn't be a yelling match or a game of fines. This battle would be fought with evidence, legal loopholes, and a little bit of creative revenge. By the time I was done, she'd wish she never set foot on my dock, and the whole HOA would think twice before messing with me again. My heart finally slowed as I pictured it. The moment her smug grin cracked in front of everyone. The moment she realized her power trip had finally hit a brick wall. That vision burned in my mind like a promise I intended to keep. No matter how messy this war was going to get. The following weekend arrived and I pulled up to my lake cabin with a fresh determination burning behind my eyes. My truck bed packed with supplies and my phone ready to record everything. The property still bore the scars of Karen's so-called community event. Beer bottles lay half buried in the grass. A dent in my porch railing told the story of someone sitting where they shouldn't have. And my dock had a set of mystery footprints stained in barbecue sauce. But instead of feeling defeated, I looked at that mess as fuel, a physical reminder of why this war was no longer optional. It wasn't just about me having my space back. It was about making sure Karen and every other HOA tyrant who thought they could grab what wasn't theirs learned the kind of lesson that stuck for life. I parked the truck, grabbed my tool bag, and began documenting every inch of the property damage. Each photo, each video clip, each trash bag filled with evidence became a weapon I could use later. I wasn't rushing this. I wanted Karen's downfall to be slow, deliberate, and impossible to wiggle out of, no matter how many fake rules she waved around. By noon, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my blood pressure spike all over again. Karen had posted a public message in the HOA online group chat, bragging that the last event at my cabin was such a success that she had kindly arranged another one for next weekend. This time promising live music, boat rides, and a catered dinner. She didn't ask permission. She didn't even pretend to. She just decided my cabin was now the neighborhood's free amusement park. People were commenting excitedly, buying entry tickets from her online link, completely oblivious to the fact that none of this had anything to do with me. My hands clenched around my phone, but instead of firing back in anger, I smiled slowly. Every time Karen put something in writing, every post, every email, every claim, she was digging her own grave. I screen captured everything and saved it in a folder labeled Operation Karen's Karma. If she thought she could keep making money off my property while treating me like a joke, then it was time to turn the joke on her in a way she wouldn't forget. That evening, I reached out to a couple of neighbors who'd quietly complained about Karen for years. Frank, who was still bitter about the tree fiasco, came over with a folder full of old fines and notices that made my head spin. Marissa brought along copies of the ridiculous wildlife violations she'd been hit with. Together, we sat on my porch, trading stories of Karen's tyranny under the dim porchlight like war veterans swapping battle scars. One neighbor told me Karen once threatened to remove their mailbox because it wasn't the HOA-approved model. Another said she had demanded he repaint his house 3 times in 2 years because she didn't like the shade of beige he picked. The pattern was clear. Karen operated like a mob boss, hiding behind bylaws, using fear and intimidation to get her way, and nobody had ever stood up to her hard enough to make her stop. That was about to change. Over the next few days, I put my plan in motion quietly. Step 1 was gathering undeniable proof that Karen was illegally using my property for personal profit. I spent an entire day pretending to be an interested guest, messaging Karen from a fake account asking about reservations for the upcoming lake event. She proudly sent me details, including a payment link and a promise of exclusive access to a private cabin. When I asked whose cabin it was, she claimed the HOA owned it. I laughed out loud in my kitchen, my phone screen glowing with her arrogance in black and white. That was the smoking gun I needed. I forwarded the conversation to my real account, stored screenshots in my evidence folder, and started building a timeline of her scams, connecting the dots between the fake HOA policies and her cash grabs. Step 2 involved locking down my property in a way that would stop her next event cold while staying perfectly legal. I called a contractor friend who owed me a favor and ordered a new industrial strength gate for my driveway, complete with a chain and coded lock that only I could open. If Karen wanted to turn my land into a party venue again, she'd have to explain to her 230 paying guests why they were staring at a locked gate with no access. The thought of her red face and shrill voice in that moment was enough to keep me grinning through the entire installation process. My friend chuckled as he tightened the last bolt, saying he couldn't wait to hear the story after next weekend. Neither could I. This was just the first stage of my counterattack. Karen thought she ran the HOA like a queen on a throne, but next week she'd find out what it felt like to be powerless on someone else's property. In between preparations, I spent hours studying HOA bylaws and state property laws, making sure everything I planned to do would hold up if Karen tried to sic her usual lawyer threats on me. I wanted this fight airtight, no loopholes for her to wriggle through. I learned that nothing in the HOA agreement gave them rights over my private cabin unless I signed it over, which I never had. Any attempt to host events or sell tickets on my property without permission was trespassing and fraud. Plain and simple. Armed with that knowledge, I started drafting letters and gathering witness statements from guests who had unknowingly paid Karen for entry to my cabin party. One couple admitted they'd driven 3 hours to attend the last event, believing they were buying tickets to a legitimate HOA-owned venue. They agreed to provide statements about how Karen misled them. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of her so-called leadership. By Friday, the trap was set. The new gate stood tall. My evidence pile was thick enough to choke a printer, and my camera system was wired to catch every second of what was about to happen. I didn't sleep much that night, not from nerves, but from anticipation. This wasn't going to be a simple win. This was going to be public humiliation served with a side of undeniable truth. When Karen arrived next weekend with her caravan of ticket holders expecting a party, she was going to learn a lesson about boundaries, ownership, and consequences in one unforgettable scene. The thought of her screeching when she realized the party was over before it began filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't felt since before this nightmare started. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back my peace and showing the entire neighborhood that the reign of Karen was coming to an end. And once it did, there wouldn't be enough fake rules in the world to put her power trip back together again. The day of Karen's second lake bash dawned hot and bright, but the air around my cabin felt like it was vibrating with tension. I had been up since before sunrise, double-checking the chain on the new gate, testing the padlock twice, even setting up my phone on a tripod to capture every possible angle of what was about to unfold. My plan wasn't just to stop Karen this time. It was to make sure the whole neighborhood saw exactly what kind of scam she had been running, to expose her arrogance so thoroughly that she would never again try to twist the HOA rules for her own gain. As I sat on my porch sipping coffee, I could hear the distant hum of engines coming down the road and my pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. My heart hammered with a mix of satisfaction and nerves as the first line of cars appeared, packed with excited strangers, expecting the party of the summer. They slowed as they reached the gate, which now stood firm and locked. A big metal barrier that screened private property in a way Karen could no longer ignore. One by one, cars pulled up and stopped, windows rolling down as confused faces peered out, wondering why their exclusive lake party had a locked gate blocking their good time. Within minutes, Karen's SUV rolled up, and just as I predicted, she hopped out like a furious queen denied her throne. She was dressed in an ice-searing lime green sundress, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, and she was already barking orders before her heels even touched the gravel. She marched straight to the gate, yanking at the chain as though sheer force of will could undo a heavy-duty padlock. When it didn't budge, she spun around and shouted at me where I stood on my porch, her voice carrying like a siren, "Open this gate right now. This is a community-sanctioned event." Her face was flushed, her manicured hands flailing in the air while the growing crowd of paying guests looked between us, confused and irritated. I didn't move, didn't say a word yet. I wanted every second of her meltdown on camera. Karen strutted up to the gate again, yelling about HOA policies and how I was violating some imaginary communal agreement, demanding access like she owned the place. That's when I finally stood, walked slowly down the path, and held up a printed copy of the state property law in one hand and her own ticket sales advertisement in the other. My phone still recording every word. Calmly, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. This is my private property. You sold tickets to strangers for access you don't own. You're trespassing and committing fraud. The party is over. The reaction was immediate and delicious. The crowd erupted in angry questions aimed not at me but at Karen. People demanded refunds, shouting that they had driven hours and paid good money for this event. A man holding a cooler yelled that he wanted his $50 back right now. While another family asked if they were at the wrong address because they had been told this was an HOA-run lodge. Karen tried to talk over them, claiming I had promised to host the event and was now reneging on the deal, but the proof in my hand said otherwise. I waved her own messages on my phone screen in front of the guests, showing how she had lied about owning the cabin. The crowd turned on her faster than I imagined, muttering about calling their banks for chargebacks. One woman even threatening to call the police for fraud. Karen's voice went shrill, shrieking for everyone to calm down, blaming me for sabotaging a community tradition, but no one was buying it anymore. The spectacle was everything I had hoped for. Her perfect queen of the HOA image cracking in front of dozens of witnesses. Then came the cherry on top. Karen, desperate to regain control, called the police herself, clearly believing that once officers arrived, they would force me to open my gate. I leaned against the post, perfectly calm now, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. When the patrol car pulled up, 2 officers stepped out and Karen immediately launched into a hysterical tirade about me, denying access to community property. But the minute they asked for proof of her claim, she had nothing to show them except her fake clipboard rules. I handed over my property deed, photos of the previous party's damage, screenshots of her ticket scam, and copies of the messages where she admitted selling access to my cabin. The officers' faces went from professional to visibly annoyed as they turned to Karen and told her in no uncertain terms that she was trespassing and that I had every right to keep my gate locked. She stammered, tried to twist the story, but they weren't having it. They told her and everyone else to leave the premises immediately before charges were filed. The crowd started dispersing, many glaring at Karen as they walked back to their cars, some filming her on their phones, probably already planning to plaster her scam all over the neighborhood's social media page. Karen's humiliation should have ended there, but her ego wouldn't let her leave quietly. She stormed up to my gate again, pointing a shaking finger at me and screeching that I would regret this day, that the HOA board would rain consequences down on me for embarrassing her. I only smiled, keeping my voice steady and loud enough for the last few lingering witnesses to hear. The only one facing consequences is you, Karen, and this is just the beginning. Her face twisted in rage, but with the police watching, she had no choice but to retreat to her SUV and slam the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Tires spat gravel as she sped off, leaving behind a trail of dust and her shredded reputation. I stood there a long moment, feeling the rush of victory swell in my chest, knowing this battle was won, but the war wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She would come back with more schemes, more fake rules, more desperate attempts to control what wasn't hers. But now I had video evidence, witnesses, and the law firmly on my side, and the entire community had seen her exposed as a fraud. As I closed up the gate, checked the lock one last time, and returned to my porch, a few neighbors who had stayed behind came up to thank me quietly, admitting they had wanted to stand up to Karen for years, but had been too afraid of her retaliation. I told them this was only step one, that the days of Karen running the HOA like a personal kingdom were numbered. The relief in their faces fueled me more than any coffee ever could. As the sun dipped low over the lake that evening, the once chaotic silence of my property felt sweeter than ever before, but I knew this calm was temporary. Somewhere out there, Karen was plotting her next move, probably foaming at the mouth that I had dared to defy her so publicly. I sat on my porch, phone in hand, reviewing every glorious second of footage from the day, already thinking about how to use it as the opening shot in her ultimate downfall. The game had changed. And from now on, I wasn't just defending my cabin. I was going on the offensive. And Karen had no idea how far I was willing to go to make sure she never tried this stunt again. The week following the failed lake bash was eerily quiet. Too quiet for someone like Karen who thrived on noise, control, and drama. I knew her silence wasn't surrender. It was the pause of a predator nursing its wounds and plotting its next ambush. I spent my days cleaning up the remaining mess from the first unauthorized party, patching my dock, scrubbing stains off the porch, repairing what I could. But every time I tightened a bolt or picked up a piece of litter, my resolve hardened. Karen wasn't going to stop. That woman would rather walk through fire than admit defeat. And sure enough, on Friday evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, I spotted her SUV creeping down the road toward my cabin. She thought she was being sneaky, headlights off, trying to slip in under the radar. I watched from my window, my stomach coiled tight, but my face calm, already suspecting she was stupid enough to trespass again. And then I saw it, the unmistakable silhouette of her car slipping through a temporary gap in the gate left open for my contractor's truck earlier that day. She parked brazenly right on my grass, almost daring me to confront her before stomping out of her vehicle and marching toward the lake like she still owned the place. I didn't go outside immediately because, as angry as I was, I realized this was an opportunity handed to me on a silver platter. Karen had crossed into my property without permission again after police already warned her. She had ignored every law, every warning, every ounce of common sense. Instead of calling the sheriff right away, an idea formed that made me grin in the dark like a man possessed. If Karen wanted to plant herself and her car on my land as a symbol of dominance, then fine. I'd make sure that car became part of the landscape in a way she'd never forget. I waited until she had wandered down to the dock, probably rehearsing some self-important speech about community access or planning another ridiculous HOA stunt. Then I slipped out the side door, grabbed my tools from the shed, and quietly went to work around her vehicle. My hands worked fast and sure, every nail I hammered into place another note in a symphony of well-deserved revenge. By the time Karen returned to her car an hour later, her face smug and expectant, ready to gloat about whatever new fake rule she had invented, the scene that greeted her made her jaw unhinge like a cartoon character. Around her car, I had built a sturdy makeshift fence 4 feet high, encircling her precious SUV like it was some wild animal in a pen. Every post was hammered deep, every plank secure, the gate padlocked tight. She stopped dead, staring at it in disbelief before spinning toward me, her voice cracking as she screamed, "What the hell do you think you're doing? You can't do this to my car." I leaned on the fence calmly, my phone in hand, recording every second, and said, "This is my property, Karen. You parked illegally. I'm securing my land. Your car just happens to be inside my fence now." Her face went crimson, hands flapping like a furious bird as she shouted that this was illegal, that she'd call the police, that I'd pay for this. I only shrugged, telling her I looked forward to explaining to the cops why a known trespasser was leaving her car on my property uninvited. Sure enough, she whipped out her phone, pacing in circles as she ranted to the dispatcher, making herself sound like the victim while leaving out all the inconvenient details. When the patrol car arrived, it was déjà vu, but even sweeter than last time. The officers listened patiently, glanced at the fence, then at me, and I handed them my property documents, the video of her sneaking in, and the footage of me politely asking her to leave multiple times before deciding to protect my land. They couldn't have been clearer. Karen had no right to be there. I was within my rights to fence off anything on my property, including her car. And if she wanted it back, she needed my permission or a court order. Her screech of frustration echoed through the trees as the officers walked away, chuckling under their breath, leaving her trapped, humiliated, and furious beyond words. Neighbors had gathered by this point, drawn by the flashing lights and shouting. They stood in little clusters along the edge of my property, watching Karen's meltdown like it was the best show in town. Phones were out, cameras rolling, whispers and laughter rippled through the crowd as Karen tried every tactic to regain control. She begged, threatened, claimed medical emergencies, even attempted to bribe me to unlock the gate. I stayed calm, leaning against a post, sipping water like I had all day to watch her squirm. Eventually, after hours of drama, she stomped off on foot, muttering promises of lawsuits and vengeance, leaving her prized SUV locked inside my brand new fence. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, knowing that for once Karen had been on the receiving end of helplessness, forced to face the consequences of her arrogance. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Karen's voice outside, shrill and desperate, as she tried to cut through my fence with a pair of garden shears. I stepped out onto the porch and filmed her again, warning that every act of damage she caused would add to the trespassing charges I already planned to press. She froze, knowing she was caught, and hissed at me that this wasn't over, that the HOA would crush me for humiliating her. I only smiled and told her I'd see her in court because this time the law was entirely on my side. When she finally slunk away, defeated for the moment, I reinforced the fence around her car, padlocking it tighter, knowing every extra hour she spent without her precious vehicle would drive her mad. Word of the incident spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Posts popped up online. Videos of Karen screaming while her car sat prisoner in my yard went viral in the community group chat. Memes were made. Jokes flew around about Karen's car finally finding a permanent home. And even people who had once been terrified of her started laughing openly at her expense. The power she had wielded for so long, built on fear and intimidation, was cracking with every new rumor, every shared clip of her tantrum. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't whispering about how to avoid her wrath. They were laughing at it. And nothing destroys a tyrant faster than ridicule they can't control. As the sun set that evening, I sat on my porch watching the orange light glint off the top of the fence that kept Karen's car locked up tight. I knew this wasn't the end. She was too proud, too vindictive to let this go without trying something drastic. But now the balance of power had shifted. She wasn't feared anymore. She was mocked, exposed, losing her grip with every desperate stunt she pulled. My evidence pile was thick enough to crush any false claim she might throw at me. The neighborhood was turning against her, and I had proven that I wasn't afraid to push back harder than she ever imagined. Whatever her next move was, I was ready. And when the final showdown came, I wasn't just going to win. I was going to end her reign for good, making sure no one else ever had to live under the thumb of a self-appointed queen who thought HOA meant hand over all. The week after Karen's car became my unintentional lawn ornament was like watching a storm gather strength on the horizon. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip and suppressed laughter every time someone mentioned the fence incident. And though many people stopped me privately to say they admired my guts, Karen herself had gone disturbingly quiet. That silence wasn't peace. It was plotting. I knew she wouldn't swallow the humiliation of seeing her SUV fenced in, photographed, and turned into the community's running joke without trying to claw back control. Sure enough, Monday morning, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox bearing the HOA letterhead filled with threats, fake citations, and demands for immediate payment of thousands of dollars in bogus fines for illegal fencing structures, unauthorized vehicle containment, and non-cooperation with community leadership. I laughed out loud when I read it because it was so absurd it could have been a comedy sketch. But I also knew Karen was rallying for war in the only way she knew how. Paper bombs and intimidation tactics. The problem for her was that I wasn't the kind of neighbor who folded when faced with HOA nonsense anymore. Not after what she'd done to my cabin. Not after the chaos and damage she'd caused. This time I was bringing the entire house of cards down around her ears. And no stack of fake fines could stop it. I gathered every piece of evidence I had collected over the past few weeks. The videos of strangers partying on my dock during the first lake bash. The posts and payment links proving she sold tickets to my private property. The police reports from both incidents. The footage of her sneaking onto my land and leaving her car. The meltdown when she found it fenced in, and now the ridiculous fines that made her power abuse undeniable. My living room turned into a command center, papers spread across the table, timelines connecting her schemes, statements from neighbors who had suffered under her reign. Frank came over with even more documents, old meeting notes where Karen had rewritten rules mid-discussion, cancelled votes to push her own agenda, and fabricated citations to punish anyone who didn't bend the knee. One by one, more neighbors slipped me copies of their own encounters with Karen's tyranny, from forced landscaping changes to threats of foreclosure over nonsense violations. By the end of the night, I had a binder thick enough to make a lawyer salivate in a plan that would finally shift the power dynamic of the entire HOA. Step 1 of my plan was exposure. I spent 2 days compiling a detailed report of Karen's actions, attaching screenshots, witness statements, videos, and police notes, making it impossible for anyone to deny her corruption. Then I sent the packet anonymously to every homeowner in the community, the county sheriff's office, and the state's HOA oversight board. Within hours of the emails going out, my phone lit up with messages from shocked neighbors who had no idea how deep her scams went. People who had stayed silent for fear of retaliation suddenly realized they weren't alone. And the tide of public opinion turned hard and fast. Karen had built her power on isolation, picking people off one by one so nobody would dare unite against her. Now the entire neighborhood was watching, angry, embarrassed they'd let her run unchecked for so long. For the first time, Karen wasn't the feared queen. She was the con artist exposed in broad daylight. Step 2 was hitting her where it hurt most, the HOA board meeting. That Thursday evening, I walked into the clubhouse carrying my evidence binder like a weapon and a flash drive loaded with videos for the projector. The room was packed, standing room only, as nearly every homeowner had turned out after reading my report. Karen sat at the head table looking smug, no doubt believing she could shot me down as always. But as soon as I stood plugged in the flash drive and began playing clips of her scams, selling tickets to my cabin, lying about communal rights, sneaking onto my property, the smugness drained from her face. The crowd gasped, murmured, then started shouting questions at her. When I laid out the timeline of every bogus fine, every abuse of authority, every witness statement corroborating her intimidation tactics, the room shifted from outrage to fury. People who had been afraid for years now openly called for her resignation. The board members, clearly panicking, tried to restore order, but couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence or the chant rising from the back of the room. Remove her. Remove her. Karen stammered, tried to claim the videos were fake, that I had orchestrated a smear campaign, but nobody believed her anymore. The final blow came when one of the families she scammed for Lake Bash tickets stood up and revealed she had pocketed over $10,000 selling access to property she didn't own, waving their payment receipts for all to see. At that point, even her closest allies on the board backed away, distancing themselves like rats, leaving a sinking ship. By the end of the meeting, a motion was put to a vote. Immediate suspension of Karen's presidency pending legal investigation. The room erupted when nearly every hand went up in favor. Karen screamed, pounded the table, threatened lawsuits, claimed she'd take the whole neighborhood down with her, but the decision was final. The HOA bylaws that she had once wielded like a weapon were now used to strip her of the very power she had abused. Security escorted her out of the building as neighbors filmed jeered, some even cheering openly for the first time in years. Watching her flail in panic, no longer feared but ridiculed, was sweeter than any victory I could have imagined weeks earlier when I first saw strangers swarming my dock. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Karen's pride was too venomous to let her slink away quietly. She'd try one last desperate move. I could feel it. But the difference now was that the entire community was awake, alert, and on my side. The reign of terror was ending, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt free. That night, as I drove home, exhaustion washed over me, but so did an unfamiliar feeling. Relief. The cabin sat quiet when I arrived, moonlight glinting on the lake. The only sound the gentle lap of water against the dock. I sat on the porch, beer in hand, thinking about how close Karen had come to ruining not just my peace, but the entire neighborhood's sense of safety. All it had taken to stop her was someone finally refusing to bow, someone willing to fight fire with fire, to shine a light on every crooked thing she'd done. And while I knew Karen wasn't finished lashing out yet, the balance had shifted permanently. She wasn't a tyrant anymore, just a desperate woman clinging to power that wasn't hers to begin with. The thought made me smile as I leaned back, watching the stars. Whatever her next move was, I'd be ready because now the war wasn't just mine. It was everyone's, and Karen had just lost her army. The calm after Karen's public dethroning lasted only a few days before the inevitable happened. She launched one final desperate counterattack. It came in the form of a lawsuit delivered by a smug courier who looked like he'd been promised a tip that wasn't coming. The papers accused me of emotional distress, property harassment, defamation of character, and something absurdly labeled as hostile vehicular imprisonment. Reading it felt like flipping through a bad comedy script. Yet, there it was, stamped and filed in county court. Her last attempt to claw back some power and punish me for embarrassing her. I didn't even get angry this time. If anything, I felt almost giddy. Karen had handed me the stage for the grand finale, a legal showdown where every ounce of her hypocrisy, fraud, and insanity would be laid bare in front of a judge. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about finishing the war in a way that left no chance of revival. Making sure Karen's HOA tyranny died a very public death. Preparation for the trial turned my cabin into a war room once again. I stacked every piece of evidence in neat folders. The videos of her trespassing, her ticket sales, the fake rules, the bogus fines, the police reports, and statements from neighbors who had suffered under her reign. The footage of her losing her mind when her car was fenced and had gone semi-viral online within the community, already destroying her reputation before we even set foot in court. People volunteered to testify, eager to finally say out loud what they'd whispered for years, that Karen had been a menace, a bully, and a fraud hiding behind an HOA title she had twisted for personal gain. I spent nights rehearsing my testimony, not because I feared losing, but because I wanted every word to land like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of her fake authority. The day of court arrived bright and crisp, and the courtroom was packed. Word had spread fast and dozens of neighbors showed up, some even skipping work just to watch the showdown. Karen strutted in wearing a tailored suit 2 sizes too expensive for her HOA salary, trying to project the image of a wronged leader seeking justice. Her lawyer, a slick man who looked like he'd spent more time in tanning beds than libraries, tried to set a tone of righteous indignation, painting me as an unhinged neighbor who had launched a vendetta against a kind-hearted community servant. But when my turn came, I didn't need theatrics. I had the truth, and it played like a blockbuster movie on the courtroom screen. Clip after clip rolled. Karen bragging about using my cabin for a party, selling tickets online, trespassing in the dead of night, screaming when the police sided with me, threatening neighbors into compliance, forging fake HOA policies. Each new piece of evidence drew gasps or muffled laughter from the gallery. The judge raised eyebrows, leaned forward, occasionally pinched the bridge of his nose as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Karen's defense crumbled faster than sandcastles in a storm. Her lawyer's objections were swatted away like flies as witnesses came forward one after another to describe years of intimidation and harassment. Frank recounted the tree incident. Marissa detailed the absurd wildlife fines. Others shared how Karen had cost them thousands with baseless threats. The final nail came from a young couple who testified that they had paid Karen directly for lake bash tickets under the promise that the HOA owned a luxury lakeside retreat, only to find themselves trespassing on my property when the truth came out. They had receipts, messages, everything. Karen turned pale, then red, then pale again as the weight of her lies crashed down around her. When it was over, the judge's verdict came sharp and fast. Not only was Karen's lawsuit thrown out as baseless, but she was ordered to pay me damages for trespassing, property destruction, emotional distress, and fraudulent use of my land. Furthermore, the court recommended a full legal review of her tenure as HOA president, opening the door for criminal charges related to fraud and misappropriation of funds. Karen's face when the gavel came down was a portrait of pure defeat. The kind you couldn't fake or hide from. As the courtroom emptied, neighbors clapped me on the back, some openly cheering, others shaking their heads in disbelief that they had lived under her rule for so long. Karen slunk out with her lawyer trailing behind, a broken queen stripped of her crown, finally facing real consequences for years of unchecked abuse. The aftermath felt like spring after a long bitter winter. The HOA held emergency elections, this time with strict oversight to prevent another tyrant from seizing control. New leadership promised transparency, fairness, and respect for property rights. The oppressive fear that had hung over the community evaporated, replaced by cautious optimism. People started repainting their houses the colors they wanted, planting flowers without fear of fines, living like homeowners instead of tenants under a dictator. As for me, I stood on my dock one quiet evening, the water calm, the sky painted in gold, finally tasting the peace that had been stolen from me weeks ago. My cabin was mine again, my land secure, my reputation stronger than ever. But the real victory wasn't just personal. It was watching Karen's downfall ripple through the neighborhood, teaching everyone that bullies only win when people let them. The once untouchable HOA president had become a cautionary tale, a name whispered with disbelief instead of fear. Her car fence meltdown still making the rounds online as a hilarious reminder that arrogance has limits. A month later, when the land next to my cabin went up for sale, I didn't hesitate. I bought it not just to expand my slice of heaven, but to ensure no future HOA stunt could ever inch closer to my property again. I built a massive wooden sign at the edge of the road where Karen once paraded her fake authority, painted in bold letters that could be seen from half a mile away. Private property, an HOA-free zone. It wasn't just a message to Karen wherever she was nursing her wounded pride. It was a message to anyone who thought they could ever pull a stunt like hers again. Standing there under the sun looking at my 2 lots of freedom, I couldn't help but laugh at how it had all started. A so-called community event that was nothing more than a scam. A desperate HOA tyrant who thought she could bulldoze me like everyone else. She underestimated the wrong neighbor. She thought she had the power to take what was mine and make me beg for it back. Instead, she lost everything publicly, legally, and permanently, while I gained not just my peace, but a reputation as the guy who brought down the queen of HOA madness with nothing but patience, evidence, and a well-timed fence. The lake sparkled that evening as if celebrating the victory with me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly at home, knowing Karen's reign was over, and no one would ever dare cross that line again.